I had always been drawn to the quiet, to the kind of silence that only the deep woods can offer. There's something about being far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional rustle of an animal that makes you feel both insignificant and at peace. But that peace is fragile, I've come to learn. It was early autumn when I decided to take the trip, far off the beaten path, into the thick of the forest. My plan was simple: to get away from the noise of everyday life for a few days, to recharge and remember what it felt like to be truly alone. I wasn't expecting much, just the wind through the leaves, the crack of dry branches underfoot, maybe a squirrel or two, and the soft murmur of the distant creek that ran through the valley. I parked my truck at the edge of a well-worn trail, the kind that most hikers use, and shouldered my pack. I hadn't intended on going far, but after the first hour or so, I found myself straying from the path, chasing an old, overgrown trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. It was the kind of trail that looked like it hadn't been walked in years. No footprints, no signs of any recent visitors. Just an old dirt path overrun with ferns and brambles, inviting me in like it knew I would come. At first, it was like any other hike, just the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves and the occasional bird call. The woods here were dense, with towering pines and oaks whose branches twisted up toward the sky. The ground was soft and springy beneath me, and every now and then, I'd pause to admire a patch of wildflowers or the perfect symmetry of a pine cone. But after a few hours, I began to notice something. The forest had changed. The trees seemed to be closer together now, their trunks thicker, their canopies darker, blocking out the sky. The path had all but disappeared, and I was just wandering through the woods, hoping to stumble upon something familiar. It wasn't the silence that bothered me. I had come for that, but the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. There were no sounds anymore. No animals scurrying through the underbrush, no birds overhead, not even the rustling of the leaves in the wind. It was too still. I stopped, standing in a small clearing. The shadows were long now, stretching over the forest floor as the sun sank lower. I looked around, feeling like I had been walking in circles, but every direction looked the same. My phone, of course, had no signal. I wasn't worried yet, but I had to admit, there was a creeping feeling starting in the back of my mind. The kind of feeling that tells you something isn't quite right, even if you can't put your finger on it. I thought about turning back, but I had been walking for so long that retracing my steps felt pointless. I had no choice but to keep going, hoping to find some sign of a trail or an old campsite, anything that might lead me back. As the light faded, I started to look for a place to set up camp. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't about to spend the night wandering in the woods. I eventually found a small patch of relatively flat ground beneath a group of tall pines. I pitched my tent quickly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled into my bones. As I cooked my meal over the small camp stove, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. It was the same sensation that had begun creeping up on me earlier. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the firelight. But when I looked, there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks or some animal in the underbrush. But as the night went on, the sensation only grew stronger. The darkness outside my camp felt different. It wasn't the usual comforting embrace of night, but something heavier, something almost oppressive. By the time I finished eating, the sun had completely disappeared, and the woods were submerged in darkness. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, trying to push away the growing discomfort. There were no sounds now. The usual chirp of crickets, the hum of the night, was absent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had always loved being alone in the woods, but now it felt different. The night felt too deep, too thick, as if the forest itself was closing in on me. I threw a couple more logs on the fire, but the flames barely pushed back the shadows. The temperature had dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a low, distant sound, a thud, like something heavy falling onto the ground. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was far off, but not so far that I could ignore it. And then there was another thud, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving in the underbrush. I stood up, my mind racing. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't move like that. Whatever it was large, heavy, and deliberate. It was purposeful. My firelight cast long shadows in the direction of the noise, but I couldn't see anything. My eyes darted around the camp, searching the dark forest beyond the ring of light. Nothing, but I knew something was out there. The thuds continued, getting closer with each passing second. My breath quickened as panic began to creep in. There was no rational explanation for what I was hearing. And then, just as I was about to reach for my flashlight, it stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that it made my ears ring. I stood perfectly still, my entire body frozen in place. Something was watching me, I was sure of it now. And it wasn't just the silence that was unsettling. It was the way the air seemed to thicken, as if whatever was out there was waiting, just beyond the light of the fire. Time seemed to stretch as I stood there, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then, finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in every direction, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But there was nothing. The beam of light swept across the trees, the underbrush, the dark space between the trunks. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. It was as if the woods had swallowed whatever had been making those noises. I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe I had just let my mind run wild in the dark. I sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the feeling of dread that still clung to me. The night stretched on, and I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, the fire crackling beside me. But I didn't sleep long. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Something large, heavy, like it was brushing against the canvas. My heart leapt in my chest, and I lay still, straining to listen. The noise came again, a low scraping sound, as if something was dragging itself across the ground. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't just an animal looking for food. It was something else. My mind raced, and I felt the panic begin to rise again. What was out there? What did it want? I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. The sound came again, closer this time, right outside my tent. And then it stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my eyes wide, my hands trembling. There was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. But then, just as I thought it was over, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, moving away from my tent. I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my pack and shoved it inside my tent, tearing the zipper open. I didn't care about packing everything. I just needed to get out of there. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs shaking as I stumbled through the dark woods. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from that thing. I ran until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, until my legs were aching and my breath was ragged. When I finally stopped, I didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was getting out. By morning, I had found my way back to the trail, the familiar path that led out of the woods. I didn't stop to rest. I just kept walking, the weight of the forest silence still heavy in my chest. When I reached the truck, I didn't hesitate. I jumped in, started the engine, and left without looking back. I never went back to those woods again. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to know. And to this day, I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me whenever I go near the woods. It's strange how something can seem so simple, so peaceful, and then in an instant you realize that you're out of your depth. Lost in a way you can't explain, but that feels so real. That was the day I wandered into the woods. Not by mistake, but by choice, thinking that a solo hike would be a perfect way to clear my mind. A couple of hours in, and I could already feel the tension slipping away, the weight of the city fading behind me. The air was crisp, and the trees, though tall, had a comforting, almost protective feel to them. The sun was high, filtering through the branches in that way that makes everything look soft, like a painting. I was hiking along a trail that had been on a map I'd picked up earlier, an easy one, marked out in a way that suggested it was well-worn, frequented by hikers and campers. I didn't think much of it when I started out that morning, just eager to get some fresh air. The first few miles were easy. The trail was clearly defined, the path worn down by foot traffic. I moved without thinking, letting my legs carry me as I breathed in the fresh, earthy smell of the woods. Everything was normal, pleasant even. Felt good. Somewhere along the way, though, I noticed the trail becoming less clear. At first, I thought it was just a small deviation, maybe a fallen branch or a slight change in the path from recent rains. But as I moved forward, the markings on the trees, the little symbols I'd been following, started to fade. The trail became uneven, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots, the dirt turning into thick mud. It didn't alarm me at first. I figured it was just part of the natural ebb and flow of hiking. I could still hear the faint rustling of wind through the trees, the occasional chirp of a bird. Nothing seemed amiss. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something shifted. I felt it even if I couldn't explain why. The air had gotten colder, and the chirping birds had grown quiet. The woods, which had felt so alive before, suddenly felt empty. There was an eerie stillness to the place, a quietness that I couldn't shake off. I checked my map again, trying to confirm my location, but I quickly realized the route I thought I was on didn't match up with the path in front of me. There were no markers, no signs of the trail I had been following. It felt like I was in a different part of the woods, though I knew that wasn't possible. I started walking faster, trying to retrace my steps. But the more I moved, the more disoriented I became. The trees all began to look the same, tall, dark, and uninviting. I had no idea where I was anymore. The path had disappeared completely. The woods were silent now, too silent. It was as if the world had stopped moving, and the air around me thickened with tension. My heart rate picked up. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This wasn't the first time I'd been out hiking, but something about this felt different. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for any of it. I stopped walking and took stock of my situation. I had my phone, but there was no signal. My water bottle was still half full, but my food was in my backpack, buried beneath layers of gear I hadn't needed yet. There was nothing on me that could help me now. Nothing except for my will to get out. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs growing heavy with each step. The shadows around me were long now, the sunlight barely cutting through the canopy of leaves above. The once familiar woods had transformed into something darker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing small sounds in the distance, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned my head, I saw nothing. It was as if the woods themselves were watching me, waiting. I stumbled forward, barely noticing the path that had reappeared in front of me. I didn't know how I had missed it before, but now it was clear. The trail was narrow, winding, and barely visible in places, but it was there. The sense of dread that had been creeping up on me subsided slightly. At least there was a trail again, even if it was barely recognizable. I moved cautiously, every step now deliberate. The sun had almost disappeared completely, and with it, the warmth that had been in the air. A chill had settled in, and my breath came out in visible clouds. The woods were colder now, darker. Eventually, I came to a clearing, a small, open patch of land surrounded by trees. It seemed like a good place to stop, get my bearings, and try to figure out what to do next. I sat down on a large rock in the middle of the clearing, my pack still on my back, and pulled out my map again. It didn't make any more sense than it had before. The paths didn't line up, and I couldn't find anything familiar. As I sat there, the sound of a twig snapping behind me caught my attention. I froze, my blood running cold. I turned slowly, scanning the darkening woods around me, but there was nothing, just the trees and the emptiness of the woods. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves, making the shadows dance in the corners of my vision. I kept hearing noises, small sounds that I couldn't place. It was probably just animals, I told myself, wild creatures in the woods. But the longer I sat there, the more that uneasy feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard something else, a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. It was the crunch of footsteps, not from an animal but from something heavier, someone walking. I shot to my feet, my heart racing. My breath was coming in short bursts, and for a second, I froze, unsure of what to do. I was alone, out here, and the idea of someone else, another person, being in the woods with me was terrifying. I listened, my senses on high alert. The footsteps continued, slow but deliberate. They were getting closer, but I saw no one. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever or whoever was out there. I grabbed my pack and started moving again, my mind racing. I had no idea where I was going, no idea where the trail was. All I knew was that I needed to get out of here, fast. I ran, my footsteps heavy on the soft ground. The woods around me were dark now, the trees looming over me like silent giants. The wind was howling through the branches, the sound echoing in my ears, but I kept running. The crunch of leaves and branches continued behind me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing, just the trees. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Eventually, after what felt like hours of running and stumbling through the dark, I broke through the tree line. I didn't know how I found my way out, but there it was, a dirt road, barely visible in the moonlight. I stopped, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back at the woods, half expecting to see something or someone, standing in the shadows. But there was nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the trees. But eventually, I started walking down the road. My feet were sore, my body exhausted, but I was out. I was safe. The woods were behind me. When I finally made it back to my car, I sat for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be going back there again. I had come close to something, close to losing myself in the woods. And I knew that, whatever it was, I'd never truly escaped the feeling of being watched. I'm back home now, safe in my apartment, but every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps behind me, the sound of someone or something following me through the woods, the feeling of being lost, alone, in the dark. And I know now, deep in my bones, that the woods are never truly empty, not even when you're sure you're the only one there. I had always loved the idea of being in the deep woods. I had done plenty of solo hikes in places that weren't exactly on the beaten path, but this time felt different. I decided to leave everything behind for a weekend, a long weekend, just me and the trees. It was a decision that had come after a stressful few months, a way to clear my head and get some space. I had planned this trip for weeks, carefully choosing the location. A quiet, remote forest, miles away from the nearest town, the kind of place most people avoid, except for maybe the occasional hunter or backpacker. I was ready for the solitude. I woke up early on the first day of my trip. The air was already chilly, and the sky was overcast. The dense trees blocked out most of the light, but I didn't mind. I preferred the calmness of the shadows. I packed my gear into the truck, making sure everything was there: tent, food, sleeping bag, the little stove I could cook on, a flashlight, and of course my map. I didn't have any plans to get lost, but I knew that it was best to be prepared. After a quick check, I was on my way. The drive took longer than I expected. The further I went, the less civilization I saw. Roads narrowed, turning from paved to gravel, then finally to dirt. The air grew heavier as I entered the deeper forest, the trees becoming thicker, older. This was no place for a casual hike. This was the kind of wilderness that demanded respect, and I respected it. When I reached the trailhead, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon. I should have been concerned about how late it was getting, but I felt an unusual sense of peace. I had everything I needed, and I was eager to set up camp. I didn't mind the thought of being alone in the woods for the night. It felt almost like an adventure, a chance to reconnect with something raw and untamed. I gathered my things and started walking. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through thick underbrush and towering trees. I kept my pace steady, taking in the smells of wet earth and pine needles. The quiet was overwhelming at first, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world, like the forest itself is holding its breath. The farther I went, the less I could hear any signs of wildlife. No birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of day, or perhaps the forest was deeper than I thought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but this felt different. It wasn't fear, exactly, just an odd, uncomfortable sensation. By the time I found a good spot to set up camp, the sky had darkened completely. I had come across a small clearing near a creek, the sound of flowing water soothing in the silence. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and built a small fire. I knew it would be a cold night, so I made sure to bundle up in my warmest clothes. The fire crackled and popped, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees around me. The warmth from the flames was comforting, but it didn't chase away the feeling of unease that had started creeping in. I tried to distract myself. I boiled some water and ate a simple meal, then leaned back against a log and watched the fire. The wind had picked up a little, making the trees sway, their branches creaking softly. It was peaceful in its way, but that nagging feeling that I wasn't quite alone refused to go away. The night stretched on, and I found myself listening intently to the sounds around me. The rustling of the trees, the occasional crack of a twig. I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that there was something out there, watching me. I made sure the fire was well stoked before crawling into my tent, zippered up tight. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made my heart race. The wind howled through the trees, and sometimes I could swear I heard something larger moving around just outside the edge of my camp. My flashlight was always within arm's reach, and my hand hovered near it every time I heard something that didn't belong. But when I finally got up to check, the clearing was empty, just the trees and the sound of the creek. The morning came slowly, the gray light filtering through the dense canopy above. I had barely slept, but I was determined not to let it ruin my trip. I packed up my camp and continued down the trail, hoping to find some sort of peace in the daylight. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the feeling of being watched persisted. It was subtle, a fleeting sense that there was something just behind me, lurking in the shadows. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees and the dirt path. The forest around me grew thicker, more claustrophobic. The trail had begun to disappear under the weight of overgrown plants and fallen branches. I pressed on, using my map to guide me. It wasn't long before I realized I had been walking for hours. The trail was getting harder to follow, and I couldn't shake the thought that I had been walking in circles. I checked my map again. There should have been a clearing ahead, but all I could see were more trees. I decided to stop and take a break. I sat down on a large rock, my mind racing. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and I hadn't heard any wildlife either. Not even the sound of birds. It was unnervingly quiet. I had the distinct feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed. I stood up and started walking again, more urgently now, trying to find the trail. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, but not quite. It was a soft rustling, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind or a squirrel moving through the underbrush, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. My breath caught in my throat as I stood completely still, waiting. It was then that I noticed the sudden absence of noise. No more wind, no more rustling of leaves. It was like the entire forest had gone silent. My pulse quickened, and I took a cautious step forward, my eyes scanning the woods around me. I knew something wasn't right. The rustling came again, louder this time, closer. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the ground as I darted between trees, desperate to get away from whatever was following me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but I felt it. Whatever it was still there, closing in. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred, and I felt a sharp pain in my side. I stumbled, crashing into a tree. I slumped to the ground, trying to catch my breath. It was too quiet, too still. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there when I finally gathered the strength to stand up. My heart was still racing, but the panic had subsided a little. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees all looked the same, a sea of trunks stretching out in every direction. Then I saw it, a figure, just beyond the trees. It was standing still, watching me. The person, if it even was a person, was partially obscured by the trees, but I could see enough to know that they were standing unnaturally still. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. I could feel my stomach drop as my mind raced. Was it a person or something else? A hunter, maybe, or something far worse? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and sprinted again, harder this time. I had to get out of there. My mind was consumed with fear, and I didn't care where I was running anymore, as long as it was away from that thing. Hours later, when the sun began to set again, I found myself back at my original campsite. How I had managed to get here, I still didn't know. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and my body was aching from the run, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't alone, at least not anymore. I wasn't going to let myself be lost again. I set up camp one more time, lighting a fire and huddling close to it. The night passed without incident. The eerie feeling didn't return. I woke up the next morning, tired but safe, and packed up my things. I didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I drove straight out of that forest, not stopping until I hit the main road. I never spoke about that weekend to anyone, and I haven't been back to those woods since. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe something else was out there with me. I'll never know. But one thing is certain, I never went back to the deep woods after that. And I don't think I ever will. I'd been hiking in the woods for most of the afternoon, and my legs were beginning to feel the strain of the long trek. The sun was sinking lower, and the thick trees around me cast long shadows across the narrow trail. I hadn't planned on staying out this late, but the day had gotten away from me. The dense forest seemed to swallow any sense of time, and now, with the daylight fading, I knew I had to start heading back. The problem was, I wasn't exactly sure where back was. It had been hours since I'd veered off the main path to explore a smaller trail that I'd found on an old map at the campsite. I'd read somewhere that it led to an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The idea of finding something forgotten, untouched by time, had intrigued me. I figured it would be a nice change of pace. But now, as the evening wore on and the sounds of the forest started to shift, becoming louder, deeper, more unsettling, I began to regret my curiosity. I stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat off my brow. The air had grown cooler, but not enough to be comfortable. There was still humidity in the air, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and makes breathing feel heavier. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings. The forest stretched in every direction, a maze of thick trees and underbrush. The path was barely visible now, overgrown with tall grass and thick ferns. I had lost the clear trail some time ago and was now wandering aimlessly. I wasn't scared yet, just irritated, annoyed at myself for thinking I could navigate through unfamiliar woods, especially as night was fast approaching. The problem was, I had no idea how long it would take to get back to the main path. And with every step, the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were taller here, their trunks thicker, the branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart jump. Was it an animal? A deer? A bear? Or something else? I didn't know, but I was starting to feel a tight knot of anxiety in my stomach. I kept walking, hoping I'd stumble across something familiar. I was no expert in survival or orienteering, but I knew enough to stay calm. After all, it wasn't the first time I'd gotten lost in the woods, but this place felt different. There was something off about it. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the occasional sound of birds in the distance or the soft rustling of leaves. But every now and then, I heard something else. A sound like footsteps, but not from any animal. Something heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused, listening intently, but all I could hear was the normal hum of the forest. Was it just my imagination? Was I starting to freak myself out? I didn't know, but the feeling stuck with me. Every step forward felt like an invitation for someone, to jump out from behind a tree. It was almost dark when I finally saw something ahead. A break in the trees, the faint outline of a structure. I quickened my pace, eager to get closer, to finally find something familiar. My heart thudded louder with every step, and I pushed through the underbrush, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. It was the cabin. I had found it, the place that had drawn me here in the first place. At first glance, it looked like something out of a storybook. Old, worn, and forgotten. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. The wood of the cabin was weathered and gray, the roof sagging with age. The windows were dark, empty, nothing but black holes in the walls. The door was half open, creaking in the wind, and the entire place had an eerie, unsettling stillness. It seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. I approached slowly, my feet crunching the dried leaves beneath me. I wasn't sure what had drawn me to it. Maybe it was the curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that it felt like I was so close to something important, something forgotten. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling the cool breeze that stirred the air. For a moment, I just stood there, staring into the darkness inside. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the quiet. It wasn't just the eerie feeling that gripped my chest. It was something more subtle. The way the cabin seemed to be waiting, like it was waiting for me. But then, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, musty. It smelled of mildew and old wood. There was a small table near the center of the room, its surface covered in dust. A single chair was tipped over beside it, as if someone had left in a hurry. There were remnants of old furniture. Shelves lined with empty jars and cans, a rusted stove in the corner, and a bed that had long since fallen apart, its frame broken and exposed. I walked deeper into the cabin, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The only sound was the faint whistling of wind through the cracks in the walls. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, but I couldn't stop myself from exploring. I had come this far. I might as well see it through. I walked to the far corner of the room, where a small bookshelf stood. It was empty, except for a few old, brittle pages scattered across the floor. I bent down to examine them, brushing off the dust. The writing was faded, but it looked like it had once been a journal or a diary. The pages were fragile, barely held together by age. My fingers lingered on the brittle edges, but I didn't dare turn them. I had no idea what had been written on those pages, and I didn't know if I wanted to find out. It was then that I heard it, a soft noise, faint but unmistakable, a tapping sound, coming from outside the cabin. I froze, my blood running cold. My first thought was that it was an animal, a bird pecking at the wood, but the sound didn't match. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't move for a long time. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of that place and never look back. But my legs were frozen. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look outside. I didn't want to see whatever had made that sound. But I had to. I couldn't just stay here, hiding in the dark, hoping it would go away. I made my way to the door, my feet dragging with each step. I glanced outside, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows just beyond the trees. a figure tall and thin standing still, watching, but then it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I bolted out of the cabin, not stopping to look behind me. I ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the earth. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees growing more twisted, the air heavier. The night was full of sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the soft hum of insects, but it was the silence that screamed the loudest, the kind of silence that told you you weren't alone. I ran for what felt like hours, until the ache in my legs and the burning in my lungs forced me to stop. I was breathless, exhausted, and disoriented, but I could still hear the woods around me, breathing with me, the rustling in the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath heavy feet. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but it didn't matter. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto the main trail. My heart was still racing, and I felt the overwhelming urge to keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking just behind me. But there was nothing. The woods were as they always had been, still, silent, and dark. I found my way back to the campsite as the night fully enveloped the forest. I didn't feel relieved, though. I didn't feel safe. There was a sense of dread still gnawing at the back of my mind. The tapping sound, the figure in the trees, the way the cabin seemed to be waiting for me. I didn't stay long at the campsite. I packed up as quickly as I could and made my way back to the main road, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. The woods had a way of twisting your perception, of making you doubt what you saw and heard. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I knew I couldn't forget what had happened. Something had been out there. Something had been watching, and it was waiting. The next morning, I drove back home, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. I tried to shake off the unease, to tell myself it was all just a bad experience, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The woods had left its mark on me, and I didn't think it would ever let go. The air was thick, damp, and still as I stepped off the trail into the wilderness. It was late afternoon, and the shadows cast by the dense canopy of trees grew longer by the minute. The forest was unusually quiet. Not even the usual hum of insects filled the air. My boots sunk into the moss-covered ground with each step, the dirt soft underfoot as I made my way deeper into the woods. I had come out here alone, for no reason other than a desire to escape the noise of daily life. A weekend camping trip to disconnect, to clear my head, to be alone. There was no one else around for miles, just the trees and the mountains looming in the distance. No trails to follow, just a map I had sketched out of the area and a vague idea of where I wanted to set up camp. I had always loved the woods. Growing up, I spent more time in nature than at home. There was something about the way the trees seemed to embrace you, how the wind could shift and make the whole forest breathe with you. This, however, was different. This was deeper than I was used to. This wasn't the kind of forest that whispered secrets on the breeze. This was the kind of forest that stood still, as if holding its breath, waiting. The path ahead became narrower, the trees more tightly packed, their trunks rising high and twisted, their roots sprawling like the fingers of some ancient creature. The woods felt like they were pressing in around me, their silence growing heavier with each step. I kept walking, but a strange unease began to creep up my spine. Something felt off, but I couldn't place it. The birds weren't singing. The wind was still. The woods around me seemed empty, as if I were the only thing in them. I paused for a moment, scanning the surroundings. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the fading sunlight. It felt like the world beyond the woods didn't exist anymore. Shaking my head, I tried to shake off the feeling. I'd been alone in the wilderness countless times before, and this was just a different place, a different mood. That's all. Nothing more. I pressed on, setting my backpack down on the ground for a moment to check my map. My finger traced the route I had planned, the lines scratching across the paper, showing the trail I had hoped to follow. But as I looked up, the woods seemed even darker, the shadows stretching longer, the air heavier. There was a rustling from somewhere behind me, and I froze. It wasn't the typical sound of leaves or twigs shifting under the feet of small animals. It was heavier, deliberate, almost human? No, it couldn't be. There was no one out here, no one for miles. I quickly turned around, scanning the trees, but nothing stood out. It was just forest, as it had been all along. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, but something still gnawed at the back of my mind, an instinct I couldn't quite shake. I looked around again, more carefully this time, but the woods stood in their cold silence. I packed up my map, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and continued forward. The trees were growing denser now, their twisted roots nearly blocking the path, the underbrush so thick that it felt like I had to push my way through it. Every few steps, I'd stumble over roots or get tangled in thorns. My pace slowed, but I kept moving, determined to get to a place where I could set up camp. An hour passed, maybe more, and I found a small clearing with a few scattered boulders, the perfect place to set up my tent. As I worked, the forest remained silent, heavy, watching. It wasn't until I had my tent pitched and the campfire crackling that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Night fell quickly, and with it, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire, its warmth creeping into my bones, but the chill in the air was persistent. The smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of pine as the fire crackled. I kept my eyes on the flames, feeling the weight of the night closing in around me. There was no sound, nothing but the crackle of the fire. I tried to focus on the flames, but something was pulling at my mind. Every time I looked away from the fire, I felt like something in the darkness was watching me. The trees loomed, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, but no wind stirred. The world was still. I stood up and walked over to my backpack, digging through it for the flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, pushing back the blackness that seemed to reach in from all sides. I turned it towards the trees, scanning the forest around me, but all I saw were the same gnarled trunks and tangled branches. I turned back to the fire, shaking my head again. "I'm just being paranoid," I muttered to myself, but the feeling didn't go away. The longer I sat by the fire, the more aware I became of how alone I truly was. It wasn't the solitude I'd been expecting. It was deeper than that. It felt like the woods had a life of their own, something that could sense my presence and was observing me. I shook off the thought. "This isn't like you," I said aloud, standing up and walking toward the fire. I needed to keep moving, keep busy. The more I stayed in one place, the worse my mind got. So I started to gather some firewood. It didn't help. It was as if the woods had come alive while I wasn't paying attention. The trees seemed closer now, the shadows darker. The wind, which had been still all evening, suddenly stirred. A soft, cold breeze whispered through the branches, sending a shiver up my spine. The air felt different, colder, as if the forest had changed somehow. I stopped moving, standing still in the clearing, holding my breath. There it was again, the sound. That rustling, but this time it was closer, much closer. I turned towards the edge of the clearing, my heart thudding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight darted across the trees, but the beam caught nothing. Just more trees, more dark shapes shifting in the shadows. But the feeling, it was stronger now. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind raced. Was it just an animal? But the sound didn't fit. It was too deliberate, too heavy, too close. The silence around me was broken by a soft snap, a twig breaking behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The fire crackled and popped in the sudden silence. My breath came in short bursts now, my pulse pounding in my ears. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the certainty that something was there, something watching me from the trees. I grabbed my pack, hurriedly throwing it over my shoulder. I was done. I needed to leave. The woods were pressing in too close. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it in wide arcs, scanning the trees. My hand trembled as I held the beam on the dark trunks and branches. Another snap. Closer. I bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hands. My feet slipped in the underbrush, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. My heart was hammering in my chest as I pushed through the trees, trying to get away from the clearing, from whatever was behind me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees crowding together in the dim light, their twisted limbs reaching out like grasping fingers. My breath was ragged now, my lungs burning from the cold air and the panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, following me, waiting for the right moment to. My foot caught on something, a root, a rock, and I went down hard, hitting the ground with a painful thud. My flashlight flew from my hand, rolling off into the underbrush. I lay there for a moment, dazed, struggling to catch my breath, before I pushed myself up. The silence of the woods was deafening. There was no rustling now, no sounds of movement. It was as if everything had stopped. I had no idea how long I lay there, my face against the damp earth, my mind racing. But when I finally got up, the woods had returned to normal. The sounds of the forest, birds, wind, insects were back. The trees, still tall and unmoving, no longer seemed to loom so threateningly. The tension that had gripped me was gone, replaced by an uneasy calm. I picked up the flashlight and stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself. The forest felt different now, less oppressive, less watchful, but the damage had already been done. I wasn't staying here any longer. I gathered my things, moved quickly but cautiously, and followed the path back. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge, but nothing else happened. The forest was silent again, just as it had been before. I didn't look back. When I finally made it back to my car, the familiar sounds of the world outside the woods, engines, voices, the hum of civilization, felt like a distant echo of safety. I drove away without a second glance, the dark shape of the forest receding in the rearview mirror. I never went back to that part of the woods. The memory of that silence, the feeling of being watched, never left me, and I didn't need to go back. The forest had shown me that some places are better